Okay, let's get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe, whoever you love, you're welcome here. This is the Biblical Scholarship and Literacy class, which we haven't done in 2 years because of COVID. This is the first time back. This is the 21st lecture on the Tabernacle, so in the middle and a restart, both. So this is lecture 21, Exodus 25 through 31, 35 through 40, the Tabernacle of Moses. I want to remind everyone that we have this webpage, which also hasn't been updated, but it will be when I get home today. We'll update the webpage, and it'll have the syllabus, the lectures, links to the slides, and links to these recordings, because I'll put these recordings after the fact up on YouTube, and I'll send an email with those links too. It also has a calendar with the upcoming classes, or will. I don't believe we'll have a class next month. I think that there's scheduling conflicts, but the month after we'll probably continue. So it's been a while, and that's because of COVID. We stopped during COVID. We considered doing it online, but without the in-person thing, it just kind of fell by the wayside. And so now that we're meeting in person again, we're going to try to restart. Because it's been a while, I want to kind of review, because it makes sense that we may not remember exactly what we're doing. So I'll remind everyone about the documentary hypothesis, which was an important kind of key to understanding the Bible that we've used through this whole thing. And that is that the Bible isn't a single book written by a single author, that especially the first 5 books of Moses are written by a compiler who compiled several earlier sources that he had access to. We name the compiler, the redactor, R, and the sources he had access to we call J, E, D, and P. There's a theory that J and E were combined first, and then D, J, E, and P were combined, but again, that's more hypothetical, but it seems to make some sense. But either way, the redactor, R, had access to what we call J, E, D, and P, and you can tell the difference between them because of their word usage. They have a different vocabulary, they have different themes, they even have different theological ideas, implications, beliefs, ways they talk about God, etc. And so you can kind of tell the difference. Now, we can't pry apart every passage, we can't tell who wrote every single passage. As you can imagine, once you put these things together, it's very hard to pry them apart. But you can think of this as something like a New Testament harmony. If any of you have seen one of those, it's when somebody takes, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and combines them into a single story of Jesus' life. And you were reading Charles Dickens' story of Jesus' life and trying to figure out where he got the different sources. And there is actually 4, right? And we know that, and we have the original sources. Now imagine that all we had was Charles Dickens' retelling of the life of Jesus, and we lost Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then scholars tried to go back through it and figure out which thing in Charles Dickens' telling of the life of Jesus came from which source. That's the situation we're kind of in with the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the name of the first 5 books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Penta, 5. The Pentateuch is those first 5 books of Moses. So we went through Genesis, and we worked our way into Exodus. Exodus has 3 main parts. The redemption, which is the story of parting the Red Sea and being freed from Egypt. Then they make a covenant at Mount Sinai in chapters 19 through 24. And then we have a section on worship, which is chapters 25 through 40, which is where we are. That's divided into 3 sections. The instructions for building the tabernacle, while Moses is up on the mountain. And while he's up on the mountain, the children of Israel have a party. This is the golden calf. Moses comes down, breaks the tables, the stones, very angry. And then he goes back up, gets some more instructions, and then they actually build the tabernacle. And so we have these, the tabernacle then is divided into 2 sections. One is the instruction set, and the other is the actual building of the tabernacle. Physical. So it's repetitive. You get 2 copies of it. Normally when we see repetitive things, we assume multiple authorship. That's probably not the case this time, and we'll show you why we think that in just a minute. So I'm going to go back through the last kind of 3 classes and just talk about what we've done. In October of 2019, We talked about the passage to Sinai. This is after they leave the Red Sea, everything that happened in the Red Sea, all the way up till they reached Mount Sinai. Remember, they have a battle with some Amalekites, and Moses raises his hands over his head, and then they make it to Mount Sinai. He hits the rock with the staff, and the water comes out. All this story, the quail, the manna, all this is in this passage to Sinai. Oops, the wrong way. So everything up until this point leads up to this point in Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is the culmination of everything that came before. From the very creation of the world, the sacrifice of Isaac, the blessing of the ark, the blessing of Abraham, his promise of seed, his promise that his seed would be redeemed, all of that builds, including Joseph, which is to get them in Egypt. It's all about this point, getting them to Mount Sinai. This is the culmination. This is the climax of the entire story. We had a diversion about, now that we've told the story of the Exodus to the mountain, we had this diversion of, well, did any of this actually happen? And we talked about, that even when you have a fictional story, there's elements that you can learn about history in it. So, for example, if you have a story of Cinderella, you still learn things about fairy godmothers, royalty, kings, balls, shoes, slippers, gowns, all this stuff, dancing, all this stuff is in that story. And so even if all the story isn't historical, there are historical lessons about the religion of Israel, especially at the time the story was written, that we can learn from this text. So it's a very historically rich document and important for historians, whether the Exodus itself literally happened. When we ask the question of whether the Exodus literally happened, we mentioned things like Troy. Troy was thought to be just a mythical story until they actually found the thing. We know that some of the elements in the Exodus story must not have happened the way they're described. There's some impossibilities in it, not just because of miracles, you can believe in miracles, but because of the sizes and the records and things and the devastation of the plagues. Those would have left a mark that we would have found, and we don't, and therefore we know that it didn't happen exactly as the text describes, but we mentioned a long list of tantalizing hints that something may have happened, that tribe of Levi at least seems to have roots in Egypt, and that there seems to have been a merger between a god from Midian, which is where Mount Sinai happens to be, and El, a god up in Canaan at a later date. And this could be explained by a migration. And Israel has this memory that their God came from the south. And so there's probably some historical kernel to this idea that this group of people came from the south to the north, and then the God of the north, El, and the God of the south, Yahweh, merged together and became considered one God. And that precipitated monotheism and all the stuff that followed. So we talked about everything from DNA evidence to the linguistic evidence to the internal evidence in the story. And we concluded that we don't know. If you believe in the historicity, great. If you don't, great. We don't know, but there are these interesting hints and parallels. Then we jump back into the story. And remember, now the narrative drops off, and you get this big section on the covenant. God proposes a covenant. You get the Decalogue, which is the fancy scholar's name for the Ten Commandments. And then you get the people's reaction to this fiery presence on the mountain. And then you get the book, what's called the Book of the Covenant, which is the text that the text itself internally says Moses wrote. That's the only part that claims Mosaic authorship. And from that, we've had this theory that Moses wrote the whole thing, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which we know isn't true. But his authorship in Joshua is claimed for not the entire Pentateuch, but the Book of the Covenant specifically, which is mentioned by name in the Exodus as that section. It's an internal book that was included in with the rest, and that's Genesis 20, 22 to 30, 23, 33. And then they have this ritual where they ratify the covenant, and that was actually where we quit last time. The Book of the Covenant contains all this stuff. Prologue, idols, altar, slaves, laws about murder, injuries, property, society, social justice, neighborliness, sacred festivals, and it has an epilogue. And so, again, it's as if you told this great story about staffs turning into snakes, waters parting, plagues from heaven, wars, raising your hand above your head so you can win a war, and then suddenly you drop into 5 years of Congress's laws, just kind of listed. And they're very secular, and there's religious elements to it, but it's all about what happens when your ox accidentally gores your neighbor. What's the punishment? And it feels a bit like a letdown, right? This is the culmination of the story, but it wasn't. In the eyes of the author, this is the point. The author was interested in the legal aspects, and they were trying to convince the people of Israel to keep these laws. And the story they told that led up to this point, its purpose, was to provide the background for why the people should keep the laws. So from the author's perspective, the laws was the point, and the story was the bookend that got us to the laws that tells us why the laws are important. Whereas we read it the other way. The story's exciting, and then the laws are kind of boring. And this is when you try to read the thing, this is usually where people start to fall off. Why am I reading this? Right? What's the point? But again, from the author's perspective, this would have been the most exciting part. You can imagine this was written by somebody who spent his entire lifetime comparing lots of different law codes and thinking about how to follow these laws and how to build a good society based on these laws.
How do the laws relate to the Ten Commandments? Are they consistent? Are the Ten Commandments a summary of the laws?
People have thought of the Ten Commandments as kind of the summary of the laws. Like if you keep the Ten Commandments, you will keep the others because the Ten Commandments give you the most important stuff. I'm not sure that was how this originally came to be. I think we had traditions that God had given Moses 10 commandments, 10 words. In fact, you can divide the commandments into 10 different ways, so they're called the 10 words sometimes. I think that tradition existed, and there was a tradition of what those 10 things were, and then there was a tradition that he had written this book of more detailed laws. And then there was all of Leviticus laws. We'll talk about the Holiness Code next class. So there's these different streams of traditions of laws that people kept, and they probably came from different regions, right? If you lived over here, then this person had this law code, right? This tribe had built its own law code, and this tribe over here had built its own law code, and then someone combined the two, and both tribes claimed they came from Moses. And my guess is that's sort of what happened with the Ten Commandments. It was a different collection of Moses' laws, along with the Book of the Covenant, along with the Holiness Code, which will show up in Leviticus, etc. So these are just things people had in the community that they all claimed came from Moses that was then compiled into this thing and woven into this story in different ways. Like in the logic of the combined narrative, Moses gets there, God speaks the Ten Commandments, all the people hear him, and they're so frightened, they say, Moses, don't let God speak to us. It's you talk to him and then tell us what he says. And then after all the people hear the Ten Commandments, Moses goes up, gets extra instructions, and then that becomes the book of the Book of the Covenant. And then later he'll go back up and he'll get all the instructions for the priests, and that'll become the Book of Leviticus, and etc. So the author weaves these things together, but they probably just come from different communal sources of laws. That's why they actually, we'll see, they contradict each other. And the compiler knew that. He could read. He wasn't stupid. We'll often point out that these laws, enemies of the Bible will point out that the law codes contradict, as if they're showing people something. And Jewish commentators have known that for a long time. And so how you work that into how you should live your life based on law codes that contradict, and they probably contradict, again, because they came from different communities, that's been a part of Jewish practice for a long time. And so they're kind of well aware of that. Yeah.
According to the question I had was, when someone's keeping kosher, is that part of a law?
Yes. So what happened was in modern Judaism, this is ancient Judaism, this happened many years before, but what eventually happened was rabbis got together and they would have court cases. People would come to him and say, hey, this ox gored my husband and he died. I want retribution. And they would look through the law code of Moses, including the ways they contradicted, and the rabbis would argue. And they would have a majority opinion and a minority opinion, much like the Supreme Court today. That entire thing has been borrowed by our legal system. There's a minority opinion, majority opinion. Both are preserved in a book that became the Talmud. And that Talmud gave the instructions for how to follow these laws. In fact, they went out and they tried to number them, came up with a number of how many laws are in the 5 books of Moses. You put them all together, you can count them up, and they get 600 and what is it? I don't remember. And then the Talmud tells them how those laws apply. And this is what I mean by the Jews have known for a long time that they contradict. They know also that it's sometimes difficult to take a law that was intended for that group and apply it to a new situation. And so they're very adept at saying, well, the intent of the law was this. That's not what we can do today because we don't have oxes, but this is the intent, so therefore this is how we apply it to our lives. And they're very good at that. And much less fundamental so than and evangelicals tend to today tend to be very the law says this, it's perfect, that is what it is and it means what it means, whereas the Talmud shows a lot more flexibility in interpreting the laws because they were dealing with this situation that they were well aware that these laws came from different places and were each different strains of interpretation of Moses. So they also believed that there was some of this involved an oral law that the rabbis had carried down orally, how these a tradition of how these laws should be interpreted, and that became part of how they made their court rulings. And so they believe in a written law, which is these 5 books, and an oral law. But again, this all happens many 600 years after the sort of time when these laws were compiled by the redactor, and so. That's a much later development, but it's a reaction to the text we're reading right now. So, again, why? I included this because I wanted to get the feel for why the author would have felt that these laws were the culmination of everything that came before. And so I've mentioned this before, but there's a form in the ancient Near East, and you can see this in documents from Egypt. You can even see this in guild treaties. I've seen people make up treaties or documents where there were contracts for doing work. Like I hire this guildman to make this house, and they all follow this same sort of pattern. A Caesarean treaty is one between a master and a lord, but the treaty pattern is actually found in even more broad circumstances, or pieces of it anyway, are found in everything from guild initiations to contracts, and especially in these Caesarean treaties between a king who conquers another nation and the people who are supposed to then follow him. And the form has a title which mentions the names of the people involved in the preamble. It has a historical prologue. The historical prologue is basically the story of how the king had done all these great things for the people, therefore the people should follow the king. So you can see in the Exodus, that's the Exodus. I saved you, therefore you should follow me. Notice salvation precedes the law. The law isn't something you do to be saved. God saves you and says, because I saved you, you should keep my laws. That's what I'm asking of you because of this historical prologue, which is all the stuff that came before, from Abraham, from Adam to Abraham to Moses and the Exodus. That forms a historical prologue. So in this context, all those stories we told, their whole purpose is to serve as a historical prologue to get us to the mountain so we can have all this legal stuff. Right? And then there's the stipulations of the code. That's what we did last time, right? The Book of the Covenant. There's then provisions for the deposit of the text and its public reading. This is where the tabernacle starts to come in. So this is how what the tabernacle section, which follows that law section, fits into the narrative. It is the provision for deposit and public reading of the text. It involves also the list of witnesses and the list of blessings and cursings. Blessings if you obey the law, cursings if you don't, and then an oath and a solemn ceremony by which you agree to follow the covenants. And these ceremonies are supposed to take place at the temple tabernacle. So this is how the tabernacle fits in. And it's why the law was the point, right? Instead of seeing them as stories with law mixed in, they saw it as a law, and the stories form the preamble to convince you why you should keep the law. And that's part of the Caesarean treaty form. So today, we get to talk about the 2 sections for the tabernacle, the instructions and the actual building. And we're going to skip the golden calf, mostly because it would be too much to do today, and we can come back to it, and it does sit between the two. But if we do the first, we might as well do the second, because the second section is a repetition of the first. It doesn't make sense to do the first, then do the golden calf, then do the second. So we'll combine them. So we'll do the 2 sections on the tabernacle, we'll come back to the golden calf, and we'll be done with Exodus, which is exciting. We've made 2 books of the Bible in 21 lectures, and we're about to have 22. It'll take us 22 lectures to do the first 2 books of the Bible. It's exciting. All right, so there are 13 chapters of a 30-something 40-chapter book. 13 of them are architectural design. Right? We had all these boring sections on law, and now we've got 13 chapters that sound like you're reading an architect's blueprint. Badly written, I might add, because it's long and detailed, and it's boring when you read it the first time. And then if you try to build something, so these are the models of the temple that I built, try to build it, and you realize right away that the text doesn't have enough description to figure out what the thing looks like. I mean, there's simple stuff like it's 2 cubits, the altar of incense is 2 cubits high. Is that with the horns or without the horns? I don't know, it doesn't say. These things may not matter, but if you're trying to build one of these, my point is that the text, as long as it is, isn't sufficient in detail to actually build one so that you know you're building it the way it actually looked. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't that the secret code of the Masons?
Not exactly, but the Freemasons have this whole connection to the builders of the Temple of Solomon that is claimed in their myth anyway. Whether that's actually right is probably untrue. But they don't claim to have the secret plans for the layout of these objects. They claim to know the secret mysteries that the builders passed along that involved special handshakes and signs that they would know each other and know that you were a member of the Masons Guild. And that Caesarean treaty shows up in guild initiation, so that also is tantalizingly fascinating. And we should, in fact, have a whole discussion on guild initiations, because they exist in ancient Egypt. We know that these guild initiations are old. Freemasonry is a late example of one of those guild initiations that probably doesn't have, it's not as ancient as it claims, but the concept of a guild initiation is pretty old, and we can trace it back. It's in fact, that is one of the best ways to make sense of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's part of these guild initiation mysteries to initiate you into the guild of the gods. So, tangent, I apologize, I'm good at these tangents, but people mention interesting things and we hit them. But the point is, we don't really know exactly what these things look like, especially since it's written, not only is the text not as sufficient detail, it's also written in Hebrew, which isn't a dead language exactly, but it sort of died and became a scholarly language, and then it was revived into modern Hebrew, which is spoken in Jerusalem, but that was a revived language. And there are words in Hebrew that we just don't know what they mean. My favorite example is the breastplate here is made of a bunch of gems, and there is extensive debate about what those Hebrew words refer to. Which gem? We know they're precious gems, but we don't know which. And each tribe gets his own gem with his tribe's name written on it. What we don't know is what those gems are. There's theories, and people have ideas, but they contradict. People contradict each other, and we're not exactly sure what is what. Okay, so 13 chapters. Somebody thought this was important, right? And even though it's like I said, it reads like you're reading an archaeological blueprint, an architectural blueprint, which seems boring to us, this meant something to somebody. And it would be useful to try to figure out what that is. Why was this so important to them? And what about it mattered? So again, one way to look at it is this is part of the Caesarean treaty form. This is how the law, which was written on the 2 stone tablets of Moses, was deposited in the Ark of the Covenant here, which is the one piece I never finished. It's made out of wood plaster, and then overlaid with gold, and then you carve into the plaster to make the inlay. And so Aaron's rod that budded, the 2 stone tablets, and the pot of manna go inside the reliquary box. So this is a method for depositing the law so that it can be taken out and reread, is how it would have been done kind of in the ancient world. This is part of the ceremony whereby the law would be remembered and kept through time and made sacred. So that was part of of why it was important. The other key to its importance might come from authorship. Who wrote this thing? And I know you probably don't remember all the details of J and who J is and who E is, and E comes from where and J comes from where. But P is the priestly source. And P is probably the latest source, possibly post-exile, possibly with earlier stuff that came from before the exile that they incorporated. So they're one of the latest authors, close in time maybe to the redactor, and their core idea is order from chaos. Society is made order is brought into society from chaos by law and ritual. And that's P's main thrust and point. And so P cares a lot about law. P cares a lot about ritual. P's account of the creation orders. It doesn't have a lot of stories. There's no Adam. There's no Eve. It's just 7 ordered days of creation, divided into patterns, and those patterns have a poetic structure to them. It's order from chaos. This is P. This is who P is. And so when we have this tabernacle made out of concentric squares with exactly equal measurements that divide into each other, 10 cubits and 10 cubits, and squares and rectangles that are all these kind of even measurements, this is P. And we think P wrote both. Now again, normally when you have repetition like this, it means multiple authorships. In this case, the repetition is so close to the original, and it uses the same vocabulary, has the same theology, the same themes. It looks like they're both written by the same person, or by P, which there's two ways this could be. There could have been two priestly traditions, and the redactor put them together this way, right? One as the instructions, one as the actual building with the golden calf between. But if so, they come from the same tradition, right? They're just two different documents with slight variations. The other possibility is just to say one person wrote both of these, and he really thought it was worth telling you that God gave you a plan for this thing, and then they carried out the plan exactly the way God told you. And as the repetition itself might have been the intent of a single author who is trying to do what P often does, order from chaos by following the instructions of God exactly. You see it? And we can also see that same theory in rabbinic Judaism today. By following the law, we bring order from chaos. And thus the law is a joyful thing we do because it's how we make order out of chaos. And so this fits within P's personality. So both of these are from P. They might be a single author. They might be two copies of a similar origin story that was put together. We don't know. But at least they have the same kind of origin. They're both in the priestly tradition. And that also helps us see the importance. The priest would have served in the Temple of Moses, or at least been the descendants, if it was post-exilic, of someone who served in the temple and who was interested in rebuilding the temple so they could serve in the temple that would have been built after the exile. These were temple priests. So of course he cares about what the tabernacle looked like, because this is, from his perspective, this is the origin of the temple. This is the first Israelite temple. This is where it all comes from. This is where the rituals come from that he spends his life doing and that he cares about. And so this matters to this author, and that would be why, one way to think about it. But obviously, it's not just because this is his job that it matters. It matters to him because for him this is a theological thing. He wants to know how you meet and know God. Ya'ad and Yadah. These two passages play off each other throughout the text, and it's all about coming to know God and meet God. And again, for P, the way you do that is through ritual and through law. So this is how William Props puts that, who is the scholar that wrote one of the commentaries of Exodus that I'll show you at the end. It says, God and Israel will Yadah, know, and Ya'ad, meet each other. The book of Exodus is riddled with evocations of these roots. Yahweh and Israel interact in two spheres that, at least for the priestly writer, are one and the same, cult and covenant. The people's regular offerings are nothing less than the periodic tribute owed to their contractual overlord. See, he's talking about the Caesarean treaty form. Because God saved them, they are now his subjects, and he is their contractual overlord. And these rituals and their offerings are the periodic tribute owed to their overlord, and the tabernacle itself is the overlord's home. It's the house of God. that they bring with them, and the offerings they make there are the sort of things that a house servant would make to their master. And this is the tribute you owe your overlord, as spelled out in the Caesarean Treaty, whose benevolence is contingent on their fidelity to these contracts. So again, order is established this way, and if you let it go, you can create chaos, and you could end up in exile. Again, from this author's perspective, that's what causes the exile. Israel is exiled because they don't keep these laws correctly, and it leads to their exile because they broke the covenant treaty they made with their Lord. There are also, on top of this, 4 main significant or themes that the tabernacle revolves around: creation, the Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, and then this palace for God. We'll see all 4 of them over and over again as we go through this material. So let's talk about it. What is it? Because I've told you what it means, right? I've overviewed what it means, but we've never even showed you what it is. So the first reference to this sort of idea is actually not in P, it's in J and E. And I'm going to read it to you, but when I do, I want you to notice how different it is than what we will later see in P. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it, quote, the tent of meeting. So what is the tent of meeting? And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And wherever Moses went out of the tent, all the people would rise and stand in each of them at the entrance of their tents and watch Moses until he'd gone into the tent of meeting. 9, and when Moses entered the tent, the pillar and cloud would descend. So they would see a pillar and cloud that would show you that God's presence is actually there. Sorry, I lost my place. Would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. And the Lord would speak to Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar and the cloud standing by the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and bow down, and all of them at the entrance of their tent. And thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. And then he would return to the camp. But his young assistant, Joshua, the son of Nun, would not leave the tent. So notice a couple things. Joshua is in charge of this tent, right? It exists outside the camp. And Moses would go there and meet with God. Notice also that this is Exodus 33. The tent, the instructions have been, come, but the actual building of the tabernacle isn't till later in the story. So the Tabernacle of Moses isn't built yet, but this tent already exists. So for E and J, there is a tent of meeting that either exists before the tabernacle, so like Moses would go out to this tent and do this thing, and then later they would build the tabernacle, and then everything moved into the tabernacle. That would be J and E's perspective, although we're not even sure J and E believe in the tabernacle, right? P comes along and tells this tabernacle story. It's possible that for J and E, the tent of meeting is all there is. And then for P, it's the tabernacle. It's also possible that J and E believed in a tabernacle but thought there was this tent that happened before. P, the tabernacle, this is, by the way, one of the smoking guns that showed us the documentary hypothesis. It helped us pry apart the sources. For P, the tabernacle and the tent of meeting are the same. He will use those terms interchangeably. For J and E, they are clearly different. He's describing something entirely different. This will also matter when we start talking about historicity. Did this tent ever exist? Maybe something like what J and E describes exists, and maybe P is embellishing, right? We don't know, again, but there's all sorts of tantalizing hints that we have different traditions that each thought of this tent that Moses carried with him differently. But there was a tradition in all of them that Moses had some sort of a tent and that he would meet with God in this tent. Right? They all have that. And then what that tent looked like is a little different in the two. P's Tabernacle of Moses looks entirely different, or seems entirely different. It has 13 chapters of detailed architectural descriptions. It's made out of gold and silver and bronze and acacia wood and silk and linen and badger skins and all sorts of stuff. And it's set up with these poles and these rods, and it's built in very, very, very precise geometric patterns. Of cubit, 10 cubits by 10 cubit square is the Holy of Holies, and then 20 by 20 is the back room, and then the 20 by 10, is the holy place, and then the curtain has like 40 by 40. Or, I may have just done that wrong. I should have put I have a picture of the dimensions. I should have put it up. But it's built in these kind of concentric squares. Again, order from chaos. And it's pitched in the very center of the entire camp. For P, the temple is the center of the world. Everything revolves around it, so it's put in the center of the camp. For E and J, the temple and the presence of God is so scary, you have to put it out there. Because it's too scary. You can't have it in here. You see the difference? Both theologies make sense, but they're different. P and J think about the world differently, which is one of the ways we know that there are these multiple sources. Again, his tabernacle has this tent, this courtyard, an altar of sacrifice, and that's moving from this side. This is the altar of sacrifice. There was a basin of water for washing, and then that was in the courtyard of the temple. And then you work your way inside, and you have these coverings over this inner tent, 4 layers of goat skin, badger skin, red ram dye, and cherubic covers. Cherubs are little heavenly angels that guard the whole thing, and they're woven into the fabric. You notice the colors here on the cherubic covering are the same as the colors that later show up in the priest's clothing. We know that these red-skinned tents and these goat-skin tents actually existed in the ancient years. We have parallels of sacred tents that were used as temples in desert tribes around Israel who all had tents like this. In fact, usually though they don't have all 4 layers, they'll have a red linen tent or they'll have a goatskin tent. And it's almost like P put them all together and made one tent out of all of them in layers. Inside, we have a candlestick which is left constantly burning oil. It has 7 branches, and it's made in the shape of, it says, an almond tree, possibly representing the tree of life and the source of light and life in the tabernacle. And then on the side is a table of what's called the table of showbread, where they put 12 loaves, one for each of the tribes of Israel. On this table, tradition says they also had pots of wine, although the text doesn't say that. And here's my model of that. And here's my model of that's over here. And that table of showbread is something that also shows up in Egyptian iconography. They don't call it that, but they also have these offering tables that are left in front of the deity's temple, the deity's throne room, the Holy of Holies. And it's this idea of bringing an offering of food to the temple, to the god, and then the priests eventually eat it after it sits there for a certain amount of time. And then right in front of the Holy of Holies is the altar of incense. The altar of incense, there are passages that describe the incense as a form of prayer. Let my prayer be set before thee as incense, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifices from Psalms. And so it was some way, you can think of it as prayer. The smoke from the incense goes up to heaven like prayer, but it also is a way to create that smoky pillar. Remember all the passages say when Moses goes in, there's this pillar of fire and smoke, and that shows that God is there. When you burn incense on this altar, it creates that indication of God's presence, the pillar of fire and smoke, right before the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is curtained off so that people don't go in there and die. In fact, the clothes have the bells on the bottom, and the text literally says the bells are so that God will hear the priest coming and can hide his face, so the priest doesn't walk in, accidentally see God's face and die. And that's what the bells are for on the bottom of the clothes. And so again, the veil divides the Holy of Holies, where God lives, from the holy place where the priests can enter and where they offer the incense, right between the two at the veil. And then inside the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant has, let's talk about that a little bit more, has 2 cherubim on top. The Bible says you can't have any image of things in heaven above or earth beneath, especially not molten or graven images. And so the text says these were beaten work, meaning they took a piece of gold and they beat it into shape so that it's almost like a lawyer's workaround. Again, what's probably happening is different traditions. One tradition had cherubim, the other tradition said you can't have graven images, and so you've got to combine these contradictory laws in some way, and they did that by saying, well, the cherubim were made out of beaten work. But what's important here is that there is no statue of God. God supposedly appears between the cherubim, and the cherubim are described as God's throne. So that back room is the throne room of God. The room in front of it is the kind of antechamber, and then the courtyard is the place of sacrifice around it. And you can see here the concentric squares shape here at the bottom right corner. Okay, the text also spends a great deal of time describing the priestly clothes. I've got a model of the clothes over here. And I really wish I had more time. I have to cover the entire... I could take 3 or 4 lessons on the temple and go through each of these things in detail, but I think that would be more than we need. I'm going to try to cover it all at once. It's a little tricky. There's a lot here, but the text describes the clothes in detail. The clothes were important to this priest. What should the priest look like, and what should his glory? The clothes are for his glory. They represent the glory of God, etc., and the priest's glory. And so they're supposed to be this very finely woven thing with colors, the same colors as we see in the tabernacle: the red, blue, gold, and purple. Purple is the symbol of royalty. Blue is probably heaven. Red is probably the blood of the sacrifice. And the gold is, again, wealth and prosperity, that sort of thing. One of the questions surrounding historicity of the text is, how did the Israelites make something so ornate and with so many precious metals? And could they have even done that, especially as wanderers in the desert who just escaped slavery? The internal consistency of the text is they took all this stuff from the Egyptians, right? Remember, they spoiled the Egyptians when they left, and this is what they used that spoil for, is to make this golden, beautiful tabernacle. But again, that has been used as evidence, because it seems impossible, that the text story didn't happen at all. And I would like to just point out, again, the same thing we did with the Tent of Meeting. It's entirely possible that a later author can embellish the tabernacle with the glory and splendor of Solomon's temple that he was familiar with, without saying that there was no tent at all that Moses had. It may just not have been quite as fine or as fancy. Which of course brings us to these historical parallels. There's a lot of... Now, historicity is interesting and important for 2 reasons. First, did it happen? And I mention that because it's an interesting question. I want to know, because I'm a curious person. But usually that's the realm of people who are arguing about whether there's a God, the debate between the atheists and the theists. And if you show it didn't happen, then clearly there is no God, right? And if you show it did happen, well, then clearly the Bible is true and it's all, but we should believe it all. And I don't think either of those positions make any sense, right? There could be a God and this could not be historical. This could be historical and really happen and there isn't a God. I don't think that's relevant to the question. So did it happen is usually the realm of this debate that I'm just not interested in, and that I don't think is actually all that interesting. But I still want to know, is there a historical kernel? Because I'm curious. But the other reason is the things we use to understand the potential historicity of the text also give us the context by which the text is understood, which is more important to me. So, for example, we have these Phoenician tent shrines. Better evidence for the Phoenician tent shrine comes from Diodorus, who tells of a tent of sacred nature pitched at the center of the Carthaginian battle camp with an altar nearby. That looks an awful lot like P's description, actually, of the tabernacle, right? But it gets better because we actually have pictures of the Egyptian version of this thing. And this is the wall. It was originally painted. It's very hard to see what you're looking at, so I'm going to show you a recoloring. Someone went through and put the paint back on based on, there's little flecks. You can tell what color things were. You repaint it. This is what it originally looked like. And what are we looking at? Well, there is a square border around it. I don't think you can see my mouse if you're on here or if you're online, either one. But there's a square, a rectangular border, and it's got these little kind of half ovals. That's some sort of a courtyard. And this is a tent. It was used by Ramses II during the Battle of Kadesh, and this was his portable command tent. This was his palace in the wilderness, right? And it has a courtyard, and the army kind of hangs out in the courtyard. And then it has an inner room, which is an antechamber, and then it has a Holy of Holies with cherubim on them. Go figure. The cherubim are these heavenly guardians. That makes sense. And in that would be the throne room of Ramses II. And so this is another one of those parallels to P's description of the tabernacle. And it fits very well. In fact, the dimensions are almost right. So it looks a lot like Ramses. So again, you can make this comparison here. put the two up at the same time and compare them. And you can see the similarities. And in both cases, we're dealing kind of with a tent. This is a tantalizing hint. It doesn't tell us that it's historical, because P could be borrowing this idea as he creates the temple, right? It doesn't tell us it's not historical. It tells us that it comes from a time, place, and culture that puts the whole thing within its proper context and provides these hints about potential historicity. The other place we can turn for understanding this context is the history of Israel's temples. The Tabernacle of Moses is one among many of a series of temples. According to the story, Moses makes the tabernacle, along with Moses and Aaron and his two human helpers, make the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark is put in the tabernacle. When they get, then there's the conquest with Joshua, and in Judges, they build a more permanent structure in a place called Shechem. And here in the middle is actually a picture of a place in Shechem with the floor plan of the temple laid over the top of it. We don't know that this is actually where it sat or if it even existed, but it just so happens that there is a ruin there that happens to have the right dimensions. So that could be it. That might have been where it sat. Presumably the ark sat there, and according to the stories around David, it's captured by the enemy, and David goes and captures it back and takes it, not back to Shechem, but to Jerusalem. And there his son builds the Temple of Solomon. Solomon is David's son, and they put the ark that David recaptured in there, in the Temple of Solomon. At this point, we start to hit what I would call the historical barrier, where we know things happened. Because from this point on, we have extra textual sources outside of Israel describing some of the kings. Not Solomon, but some of the kings who came after are described in detailed text from the time period and from outside of Israel. So from inside the Bible, but also from around the area. And we also start to get archaeological excavations of Israelite temples. So there was one temple at Solomon that had the ark. That was its claim to fame. And there were these other side temples all around it that didn't have arks. But they're relevant. And then at the time of Hezekiah, the side temples are shut down, and worship is centralized at Jerusalem, at the Jerusalem Temple of Solomon. Then the Babylonians attack, and the temple is destroyed, and the ark is taken. Presumably, there was a real ark, because it's lost when the Babylonians attack. Open question: where did said ark come from? Who built it? When was it built? P's description of when it was built is this Exodus Moses story. And that's his entire point of the ark, is to put the tablets of stone that have the law in it. We know the ark was real, therefore it probably did have tablets in it. And the question is, where did it come from? Right? And where does this chain of historicity actually go? How far back? It goes back to the Temple of Solomon. Does it go back to Solomon as the builder, or did someone else build it? Is that just a myth? We know the temple existed. Did Solomon really build it? Did the ark really exist there? Did David really recapture the ark from his enemies? Did he really put it in the temple? Did it really sit at Shechem before his enemies captured it? Is that really where it sat over on this picture here? And then the question of questions is, did it actually come from a tent that was carried into Israel by ex-slaves? The Exodus. And so somewhere between Exodus and the temple, the mid Temple of Solomon, we move from mythical to historical time, and we don't know where some of these historical pieces begin to pick up. The ark is another interesting thing with important historical parallels. It's a reliquary box, a box where you put the two tablets, Aaron's rod that budded, and the pot of manna. But we have boxes like this from Egypt on poles, usually built like a boat, thus the term ark, boat. Right? Although the Hebrew, the word just means bark, a box, but we think there's a boat connotation, and so in English it works. And so for the Egyptians it was a boat, because this is the boat of the gods. It sails across the sky because the sky's blue because it's made out of water, right? And so they carry it on the priests carry it on these poles with these aprons. Looks kind of like the apron of the ephod on the priest's clothes here. Right? So the priests with aprons carry this thing on poles, and there are two cherubim on either side, and the statue of the god, sits between the two, and this whole thing is God's throne. So the idea here is this is a throne for a god. Therefore, we can interpret the Israelite version. It is a throne for a god. We also have these thrones with these cherubim on either side from Greek mystery religions. They also show up in Mesopotamia as the king's throne with these cherubim on either side of it. The king would actually sit on them, and the text in Exodus and elsewhere will describe God enthroned between the cherubim. So this whole thing is God's throne. Again, this tells us what the Holy of Holies is. The Holy of Holies is God's throne room, and the other room is the antechamber and the courtyard, etc. And we actually have in those other, remember I told you about these other temples, and I've mentioned this before, but those other temples that the Israelites had before Hezekiah centralizes worship, one of them is a rod, and it has 2 stone tablets in its Holy of Holies. Not an Ark of the Covenant, but it does have 2 stone tablets. We've actually excavated this thing and found them. One was smaller than the other and lifted up on a slight pedestal, and there were 2 altars of incense, one on either side, one slightly smaller than the other. We know what's going on here because the Bible tells us. This is the worship of Asherah in the temple of Yahweh. In other words, it's the belief that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had a wife, Asherah, and they're worshiping both of them in the temple, and that's why in this temple there are 2 stone tablets, one for Yahweh, one for Asherah. It is possible that the entire tradition of 2 stone tablets comes from that, and they've just forgotten. The Bible looks upon this with abhorrence. The biblical authors think this is bad, this is wrong, but this is authentic early Israelite worship, and we can see it in these actual physical temples, and they give us hints for what the meaning and interpretation of the Ark of the Covenant is. All right, remember I said there were 4 things? Creation was one of the 4. So in the ancient Near East, the way you create is you fight a battle with the sea serpent. Marduk does this, Baal does this, Zeus does this. Right? You fight a battle with this sea serpent, and you fashion the world out of its body. You create order from chaos. The sea serpent represents chaos, and you impose order on chaos, and by imposing order on chaos, you create. That also happens in P. P is very anti-pagan mythology, and yet even in P, there's originally the deep, the waters, and God divides the waters from the waters and says, "Let the dry land appear." You remember this? It's this triumph over the waters. In the entire Exodus narrative, the same thing happens. God fights the Egyptians. They pass through the waters of the Red Sea, and then you create the temple at Mount Sinai. Just like the mountain where the dry land appears, this is Mount Sinai, and then you create the temple at Mount Sinai. So this whole story is tied up with creation. But the temple account itself is tied up in creation by the P author. P has creation happening in 7 days, as we've mentioned before, in 2 3-day cycles, and then a 7th day of rest. The first day creates light and dark, so on the 4th day, the sun and the moon are created, which move through and rule the light and the dark. In the 2nd day, the water and the sky is created. So on the 5th day, the fish and the birds are created to move and rule the sky and the water. In the 3rd day, the earth and the vegetation is created. So in the 6th day, the animals and mankind are created to rule and move among the earth and the vegetation. You see how each one of these lines up in kind of a poetic pattern. And then on the 7th day, you rest. So when Pete tells us the story of the building of the tabernacle, and the Jews have noticed this for a long time, he tells it in 7 periods of the Lord said to Moses. The Lord Yahweh said to Moses. In P's account of the creation, he says, Elohim said, let there be light. Right? God said, let there be light. God said, God said. For P, the name Yahweh is not known until Yahweh reveals that name to Moses. So P will use Elohim right up until the point where then P says, in one of the famous P passages, God came to Moses and revealed his name. My name is Yahweh. By El, I was known among your ancestors, but my name, Yahweh, was not known, and I'm revealing it to you, Moses. And from then on, P will use both names, El and Yahweh, to refer to God. So in the creation, it's El, and El says. So creation is divided up into 7 passages of El says. When he comes to tell the story of the temple, it's divided into 7 passages of Yahweh said to Moses, and Moses obeyed and did these things. So in the first one, it's the longest, and that has the temple, the clothes, the furnishings, including the lamp, which you could tie up to the light if you wanted, but that's maybe stretching because it has everything, and all the temple and tabernacle and stuff. In the second day, you have a shekel offering, and the third day, you have the bronze basin. It is, and after those 3 days, you have the entire structure and the money to pay for the structure set up. The next 3 days set up what is done inside that structure. You have the anointing oil, you have the incense, and you have the 2 people, Bezalel and Oholibab, who are the craftsmen who were given the Spirit of God to help them make this thing. They're given the Spirit and wisdom. Spirit and wisdom are 2 terms tied up in the rest of Scripture with the creation. God created by his Spirit. The Spirit of God moved upon the waters. And the female wisdom, personified as a female deity, was with God at the beginning, and it's through wisdom that God created. It almost turns it into a sexual union between God and wisdom that allows the creation to happen. And so these 2 people are said to be the people who are going to build the temple, and God gives them wisdom and the Spirit so that they have the inspiration to build something beautiful to God. I should point out that people often will criticize the attempt of building something like this for God. Why not give it to the poor, right? But there is a human desire to build something beautiful, and I felt it when I made these models. Like trying to make something beautiful for God is this very moving sort of powerful thing that hits you in the gut, right? And so this story is about someone doing this. Is why people have built temples and painted great art and written great music because of their religious belief through all time. And that's what we have here is 2 master craftsmen who build this thing because they're moved upon by the Spirit and wisdom of God. I think I don't have to tell you how similar those 7-day cycles are. In fact, Jews have noticed this 7-cycle thing as well. And for them, they used it in the Talmud to explain what work can be done on the Sabbath and what work can't. And they asked the question, is this part of the work that Bezalel and Oholibab might have done to make the temple? If it is, that's the sort of thing you should rest from. If it's not, then maybe you can do it on the Sabbath. But that's how you decide what can be done on the Sabbath and what can't. Is it part of the creation of the tabernacle? Because the creation of the tabernacle is human work that we do, whereas the first creation was God's work, right? And God rested. But what is human work? Well, it's the stuff you do to make the tabernacle. And this became the linchpin of the Talmudic interpretation of what is work and what is not, which the Torah leaves out. And this is the point, that the law is, you need more than just the law. You need some way to interpret the law for your time and your day, because your day is very different. Which leads to questions like, can you turn the oven on? Ovens didn't exist in the days of Moses. All right, can you turn on a light switch? And depending on how orthodox you are, the answer is yes or no. And that's based on these rabbinic arguments. But again, they're trying to interpret the law for our day. We'll talk more about law in a bit. There's a lot of other parallels, though. So again, this idea that the 2 are parallel is well known in Jewish circles. They know these 2 are parallel. But there's a lot of other reasons besides those 7 days. Like, and the heaven and the earth were finished, and on the 7th day God finished the work. Right? You see that same thing in Exodus. And all the work of the tabernacle, the tent of encounter, was finished, and the Israelites did everything that Yahweh had commanded, all the work that he had done. Notice also, God saw all that he had made and found it very good in the creation. And Moses saw all the work and found that they had made it as Yahweh had commanded. Notice what makes it very good. Done exactly the way God commanded. So for P, that's what makes it good, right? It's done the way God commanded. But even that is parallel in kind of an offset way. And then God blessed the 7th day and made it sacred, for on it God made the heavens and the earth. So Moses blessed them after seeing all the work and seeing that it was good, so Moses blessed them. The whole thing ends with a blessing. And God blessed the 7th day and made it sacred. And you shall take the anointing oil and anoint the tabernacle and all that is in it, and you shall make it sacred, along with all its furnishings. It shall be sacred. You see the parallels? And there's a lot more, but I'm just giving a few. The next piece is the Garden of Eden. This is a little harder because the Garden of Eden story is written by J and the tabernacle is written by P. So what is P doing? paralleling a J story. There's a lot of ways to do this. One is just to say that P is paralleling the Temple of Solomon, and J is familiar with the Temple of Solomon, and that's where all these parallels come from. But it is very clear that both the temple and the tabernacle are intended to be remakings, a model of the temple of the Garden of Eden. Let me show you why that is. You see the parallels? When you draw it this way, it's intended to kind of bring them out. I could do the same thing I did with the creation and list all the words that are repeated in both stories, but this gives you the idea. In both, there's a cherubim who guard the way. You have a tree, and you have the candlestick. You have the waters and the basin, and you have the altar of sacrifice. And it's not actually drawn on this, but it should be Cain and Abel make a sacrifice right outside of the temple, right side of Garden of Eden. And this is where Cain and Abel offer their sacrifices. So the altar of sacrifice all the way through back to God and the tree in the middle, parallel. And the point here is an important one for Israel, especially as exiles, right? One of the main themes of Israel is reversing the exile. They're kicked out of their home. They want to find their way back to their promised land. And the fall story is a story of exile. So the temple is this story of using sacrifice, washings, anointings, obedience, holiness, removing all impurities so that you can go back in. It's trying to find a way back. Remember how we started this? The goal is to meet God and to know God. In other words, to reverse the fall, to find a way back in. And in Christian circles, that would be referred to as an atonement, and they would think of that in terms of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice. But in Jewish tradition, it's the temple and its sacrifices that perform this act of atonement and reversal. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest gets to go all the way back into the Holy of Holies with the blood, sprinkles it on the altar, and makes atonement for all of their impurities and washes those away, which we'll talk about in Leviticus next time. Two more. And this one may be the most significant, and that is Mount Sinai. There's the temple and tabernacle has 3 zones. There's zones where everyone goes, and there they offer sacrifice and bind themselves to the covenant. But there's also this place further up where maybe the burning bush would have been, and notice the candlestick and burning bush. This is where Moses and Jethro Moses and Joshua and the elders and the priests, Aaron, go. And then Moses goes to the very top, past a cloud veil, and behind that God writes on 2 tables of stone. And that's the Holy of Holies. So the tabernacle itself has 3 divisions, including a rock where Moses strikes and gets water. So there are 3 divisions, and all of the elements of the temple, including a sacred meal and a feast, that's the table of showbread, the burning bush, that's the candlestick, the rock, that's the water, there's the altar, and the cloud veil, and the altar, the pillar of incense, the altar of incense, make the cloud veil, recreate the cloud veil when you burn incense. Oh, the other thing I should have done, I have incense. I should have brought some. I don't actually know if I can burn it in here. Probably not, but we could go outside and do it. Maybe I'll do that next time. We'll actually see what it smells like. My incense altar actually works. You can burn incense and see what it smells like. And then, of course, God's throne is up in heaven. So the idea of the tabernacle is to take God with them. So again, I want to emphasize this point. Israel wanders through the wilderness, makes it to the tabernacle, makes it to Mount Sinai, meets God, and God says, Mount Sinai is my home, but I'm about to travel with you into Jerusalem. Remember that whole story we told about taking a God from the south to the north? That's exactly what's happening. God is coming from the south, and he's going to go with them. But if he's going to go with them, they have to make him a home, because he can't take Mount Sinai with you. So you make a model of Mount Sinai. It becomes God's sacred temple, God's sacred house. The priests become God's household attendants who wash, clothe, anoint, feed him, and bring him food and offer sacrifices. And then you take God with you from Mount Sinai into Jerusalem, and that's the conquest. So this is a way to bring God with you by having this building, which is this portable Mount Sinai that God can come with you. I apologize, by the way, we've gone a little older because I spent like 15 minutes reviewing because it's been 2 years. But this is actually my last slide. And then that last point is that this is God's palace. And we see in palaces from the ancient Near East patterns that mirror the Temple of Solomon and therefore mirror the tabernacle. And we saw it in Ramses' portable palace. But we also see it in physical palaces built all throughout the ancient Near East where this same sort of division with a throne room and an antechamber and a porch and a courtyard is what we see in palaces as well as for kings. So the idea is God is king. This is his palace. He's coming with you because you're taking Mount Sinai with you so that you can go into the promised land with it. Oh, and by the way, this is the Garden of Eden when things were right. Because remember, in the Garden of Eden, man and God walked together in the garden. Well, this is how you get to know God. How do you know God, and how do you meet God, and how do you then dwell with God and bring him with you to your new home and create a promised land out of it? That's the meaning of the temple to the people who would have used it and created it. And we can do a lot more. Like I could spend time on each of the objects. I could show the Egyptian parallels. I could show you Mesopotamian parallels to each thing, the ark, the altar. We just don't have time, and I think that would be too much. But maybe we'll do that at some other time, maybe in a comparative religion class. We can talk about ancient Israel and go through some of these in some more detail. But if you want more, there are several other sources you can look at. One is this, I quoted this individual once, at least in this talk. This is William C. Prop. He wrote a commentary on Exodus. There's 2 volumes. Today's comes from the 2nd volume, but both volumes are good. Another one, if you're interested in something a little bit more down to earth and simple and shorter, there's an audiobook called Exodus for Normal People by Pete Enns. It's really good. I stole a lot of stuff from today's talk from Pete, and so he deserves lots of credit. He also has a podcast called The Bible for Normal People, and he has a section called Pete Ruins Exodus. In 6 parts, but he goes through the entire Exodus in 6 lectures. It's about how many I took to get through Exodus. And he goes through it in his podcast, and he's called Pete Ruins Exodus. It's tongue-in-cheek. He also likes to talk about how the Bible for Normal People is the only God-ordained podcast on the internet. He's doing that firmly with his tongue in his cheek. He's making fun of evangelical fundamentalism when he does that. But his stuff is excellent. If you want to listen to his podcast or his book on Exodus, that's excellent. He also has a section on Pete Ruins Leviticus and Pete Ruins Isaiah, if you're interested in those. And he doesn't really ruin them. He makes them wonderful in my mind. And so I used a lot of stuff from Pete. If you're interested in something a little more scholarly but interesting, there's this book. This is an article. It is available online. It's free. You can download a PDF called The Tabernacle, A Study from Archaeological and Historical Approach by Frank Moore-Cross, who recently died about 10 years ago. Unfortunately, he was a very, very good scholar, fairly conservative in his views, but what he does here, which carried over to a lot of scholarship after this, is he's the one who goes through all the parallels to the tabernacle between the Phoenicians and the Egyptian, and Ramses II Battle Tent. He goes through all of that material in this excellent article. It's free. It's online. It's thick reading, but it's really good. And a final book, Sinai and Zion, An Entry into the Jewish Bible. This book claims that the entire story at Sinai is the point of the Bible and is the point on which the rest of the biblical text turns. And he makes that point by claiming that the temple is this microcosm, the sort of thing we just talked about of Mount Sinai. It's a way to take Mount Sinai with us. It's a way to meet and come together with God, and then to have covenant with God. And then when that covenant is broken, that's the explanation for why the Babylonians are allowed to destroy the temple. And then this whole idea of redemption coming back into the land is built in this whole Garden of Eden reversal. And so he kind of lays out all of that as a fulcrum in all of Jewish history. He places the temple, as a fulcrum in Jewish history. It goes back to the tabernacle and Mount Sinai. Okay, I'm over. But if you have to leave, that's fine. If you want to ask a couple more questions, that's also fine. Go ahead.
After the Babylonians conquered Israel, did the Babylonians record anything about the Ark of the Covenant?
Not that I know of. We do know that they had a tendency to take the idols of their conquered people to their temple and put them in their temple. And I used to be able to answer that question with more detail, but it's been a long time, and I looked into it, and I don't remember any reference to it. But there's no reason to think they would have made reference to it specifically. They do make reference to taking the spoils, I think, from Jerusalem back to Babylon. But that part is a fairly well-attested historical. In fact, we can see we've uncovered the ruins of the conquest. We can see the destruction layers, and so that's an event that we kind of know happened about when the Bible says, and there are texts around the Bible that describe it. But I don't think they mention the ark specifically. But they do mention, I think, sacking the temple, as I recall. It's been a long time since I looked at that stuff.
Outside of the Bible, are there any independent descriptions in any way of the Ark of the Covenant?
Not that I know of. When the temple is destroyed by the Romans, they carry all the artifacts away with them to Rome, and the temple the ark obviously isn't there, but the other pieces are. And they actually built. If you go to Titus's arch, you can see the Roman depiction of the spoils they took from the Jerusalem temple, including the 7-branch lampstand and the altar of incense, and all that stuff is there. But the ark obviously wouldn't be there. It would have been older. So if your question is the ark a historical thing, is it possible that the entire ark itself is ahistorical? Yes, it's possible, I think. But the destruction of the temple isn't, and every tradition from times back when we have written documents, including Isaiah, right? First Isaiah is usually ascribed to actually Isaiah, someone who lived during Hezekiah's lifetime. And he mentions the ark, that sort of thing. So there was certainly traditions that it's there. You asked outside the Bible, though. That's an internal biblical source, but it's a biblical source that's assumed to be contemporary. Some of these documents were written many years later, but some of them weren't. And so we have some of these old texts that do seem to mention the ark. Ezekiel was written in exile, but his whole thing with the chariot of God is about the ark. And he would have been alive when the ark was taken into Babylon. So, and I assume, and I think with good reason, that the ark is a historical object. Is it possible I'm wrong? Yes, but I don't think so. And if it is a historical object, then the question is, where did it come from? Because all the traditions say it came from Moses. Well, but we don't even know if Moses was a historical figure, so how far back does it actually go? It's a good open question. Yeah. Here and then here. Here and then here.
I have a question.
Oh, you did?
Thank you.
Did you?
Well, I did. You mentioned that this second room inside the tabernacle that had something covering it was God's place. And that the priests wore these veils so that when they came in, God would have time to cover his face. So what my question is, did they think God was a physical body presence, or did they think it materialized and then dematerialized? Or was there really someone playing that part of covering your face? What was going on there?
So in a pagan temple, there would be an idol there. In this temple, you burn the incense and it creates this pillar of smoke that hides the presence of God. There is a tradition. We'll talk about Moses covering his face later, but there is a tradition that if you see God's face, you die. But the authors, you shouldn't be surprised by now, the authors disagree about that. J and E and P have different opinions about whether you can see God and how much of God you can see, etc., and live. We'll talk about that in Leviticus, or in the golden calf and story next, actually. How physical did they think God was? I also think that depends on which author you listen to. J is very anthropomorphic. God walks around the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day. Adam shows up, and God asks Adam questions that he should know the answer to if he's an all-knowing God, but he acts as if he doesn't. And he either knows and just is trying to get Adam to talk, or he doesn't know. Moses argues with God and changes God's mind. In fact, the text says God repents. The word for repent means to turn around, which is probably related to the tabernacle, right? In the Exodus, you head out one direction, then you turn around and you head back the other. But to repent is to turn around. And so God, in other words, to change your mind. And that's exactly what God does. And God does it because Abraham argues with him, Moses argues with him, and in both cases changes God's mind. These authors had, to one degree or another, a different amount of anthropomorphism for God. Some of them more than others. J's God is the most human. P's God is the most distant. But both of them have this kind of anthropomorphic feel for God. And then one of the questions you have to ask is how much of that is allegory and how much of that is actually what they thought. I don't think we know. I do think we know that the further forward in time you go, the more allegorical God becomes, and the less anthropomorphized he becomes. The earlier texts are the more anthropomorphic ones.
Thank you, James.
You're welcome. Thank you all for coming. It's good to be back. So I'll see you in a couple months, and we'll do this again.